Early 1945, World War II was already heading towards its climax. The Americans had conquered islands like Guadalcanal, Collection, Saipan and Beautiful, in battles where victory always came at the cost of rivers of blood. Japan was retreating, but not broken. And the United States, now in control of the skies, had a clear mission: take the war to the heart of the empire of the rising sun. In the midst of this ocean of violence and smoke, there emerges Iwo Jima, one black rock, harmless looking at first glance. A piece of volcanic land about 20 km2, isolated, without significant vegetation, with hot, dry soil loaded with sulfur. The natives already called it Sulfur Island, and the name made sense. The floor literally smoked underfoot. But Iwo Jima wasn't just a rock. It was a vital point on the war map. Located exactly between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese archipelago, she was in the direct route of B-29 bombers that took off daily with the aim of incinerating Japanese cities. The Z-2 planes carried bombs, but they also carried men, and these men were dying in large numbers. Many were shot down on the way there or back. There was nowhere to land in case of emergency. There was no help. Iwo Jima then became more than an island. It became salvation. If the Americans took it, they could build an air base there, a rescue point, a platform for fighters that would escort the bombers to Tokyo and back, save lives, hasten the end of the war, prevent an even bloodier invasion. It all depended on one thing: conquer that hell of ash and black rocks. But there was a problem, and it was a huge problem. The Japanese High Command also understood the importance of Iwo Jima, and they had placed a special man to defend it, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He knew he couldn't stop the Americans from conquering the island, but he swore turn every inch of Iwo Jima into a killing field. He dug tunnels, positioned artillery in hidden locations, and created underground fortresses unlike any the key world had ever seen. His goal, not to win, but to make the enemy bleed until he can't bear it anymore. The island was a trap, a den of demons, a sacrificial altar, and the Americans, eager for victory, were about to step on it. Iwo Jima had no idyllic beaches. It had no palm trees dancing in the breeze. It only had black sand, smoke, and the promise of death. An island that seemed insignificant on paper, but that, within a few weeks, would go down in history as the stage for one of the bloodiest, most intense and desperate battles of World War II. And it all started with a simple question: why Iwo Jima? The answer would come in blood, sweat, and burned flesh. General Kuribayashi, modern samurai American intelligence, believed that Iwo Jima would fall in 5 days. 5. It was a small, isolated island with few Japanese. But what the Allied generals didn't know, or chose to ignore, was who was in command of that island. His name was Tadamichi Kuribayashi, and he was no ordinary general. Kuribayashi was not a fanatic. He was not a blind kamikaze. He was a brilliant strategist, educated in the United States, where he lived and learned to respect American industrial and military strength. But at the same time, he was a man of honor, discipline, and loyalty to the emperor, like a real modern-day samurai. He knew from the beginning there was no escape, there would be no reinforcements, there would be no victory. But even so, he didn't consider surrender. His plan was different: make Iwo Jima so expensive, so bloody, so horrible for the Americans that they would think twice about invading mainland Japan. And for that, he tore up the Japanese warfare manual. No immediate suicides, no bayoneting in open fields. Kuribayashi ordered his soldiers to do something radical: dig and dig and dig. For months, the Japanese turned the island into a hellish anthill. They excavated more than 20 kilometers of tunnels that connected hundreds of pillboxes, bunkers, machine gun posts, ammunition depots, command rooms, and even underground hospitals. Everything hidden under volcanic rock, everything shielded from bombs. From the outside, the island looked empty, but inside there were more than 21,000 soldiers ready to die fighting. Kuribayashi banned suicide attacks. He ordered his men wait until the Americans disembarked and sank into the hot sand, for then, from underground, began the massacre. No random fighting. Everything would be coordinated. Everything in its own time. Every bullet, every grenade, every soldier would be used with surgical precision. The general also organized cross-kill zones. The machine guns were positioned on elevations, never facing the beach, but always from the side, to catch the Americans at an open angle. The cannons were hidden in caves, with small openings that made them practically invisible to the enemy. They Jimaviru, a cemetery ready to be activated. And there was something else. Kuribayashi forbade his soldiers to die. In vain. No dying too soon. Every Japanese man should kill at least 10 Americans before falling. It was the order. It was the mission. He knew Japan was losing the war, but on Iwo Jima, he planned gave the enemy the most cruel battle he had ever faced. And as American bombers approached on the horizon and warships circled the island like hungry vultures, Kuribayashi and his men were already ready, waiting in silence under the smoking earth. The island was armed. The stage was set. All hell was about to break loose. Enjoyed the story. Subscribe now to never miss the bloodiest battles in history. Even before the first Marine set foot on Iwo Jima, the sky was already falling over the island. The American war machine wanted to ensure one thing: annihilate every Japanese defense before the landing. And for this, he started what would be the largest and most intense naval and aerial bombardment in the history of the Pacific to date. There were 72 consecutive days of destruction. 72. Day and night, battleships, cruisers and destroyers surrounded Iwo Jima, spewing tons of shells onto the black rocks in an earth-shaking storm of steel. Every corner of the island was hit by bombs of 400, 800, up to 1,000 kilos. It seemed impossible that anything would survive. From the sky, the B-24 Liberators, and then the ones themselves, B-29 Super Fortress, rained fire on the marked targets. Mount Suribachi, Japanese airfields, supposed artillery positions, machine gun nests. Explosions shook the air. Black sand flew like smoke. It was as if hell itself was being unleashed upon the island. But there was one terrible detail. The enemy was not exposed. Kuribayashi and his engineers had foreseen all of this. The Japanese positions were not on the surface. They were inside the island. Excavated deep, protected by concrete and volcanic stone, the underground fortresses withstood the bombardments as if they were cocoons of steel. From above, the aviators saw the island explode, but down. There, the Japanese just waited, unharmed, silent, hidden. The royal defenses were untouched. For 10 weeks, thousands of tons of explosives fell on Iwo Jima. The Americans were certain they were crushing the enemy. They couldn't survive this, they said. They must be dead by now. But Kuribayashi continues. And with him, 21,000 warriors hidden in tunnels, bunkers and caves, all waiting for the moment to emerge from the bowels of the earth as vengeful ghosts. When the ships ceased fire at dawn, February 19th, 1945, the beaches were covered in smoke, crater by crater. The surface of the island appeared to have been pulverized, but the real fortress was intact. And the worst, nobody knew about it. The Americans were about to disembark. They thought they would go into ruins. In truth, we're walking into a living trap. The largest bombing raid in the Pacific had failed. The price for the mistake was about to be exacted. In blood. Want more epic war tales? Hit subscribe and live every battle with us. The morning was sultry. The sea was too silent. The onboard clock read just before 9 o'clock. Thousands of men were packed into the holds of the transport ships, packed like sardines, sweating cold. Outside, the waves crashed against the hulls, and the sound of the landing craft's engines echoed through the salty air. They were heading into the unknown. They were going to Iwo Jima. On February 19th, 1945, the 1st, 4th and 5th United States Marine Divisions, nearly 30 1,000 men launched themselves against the island's southeastern beaches, aiming to clear the way and seize the 2 Japanese airfields. The plan was straightforward: land in force, clear the gap, consolidate the line, and advance rapidly. But the beach, that damn beach, was different from all the others. Black sand, volcanic, thick, scalding. Each step sank up to the knee. Every vehicle got stuck. Each barrel of ammunition seemed to weigh 3 times as much. And then, what caused strangeness? There was no resistance, no bullets, no explosions. The first waves of soldiers managed to get out of the boats and reach the beach with ease. Some even thought the bombings had worked. This will be easy. It was the last calm thought many of them had. Because then, at 9:10 a.m., when the beach was already full of soldiers, tanks, ammunition, radios, and boats, all hell broke loose. Suddenly, simultaneous explosions began to rip through the air. From inside the mountain, from the flanks of the island, from invisible casemates, the Japanese machine guns opened crossfire. Mortars began to fall in sequence, adjusted to the millimeter. Anti-tank guns emerged from holes in the rocks, firing at the armored vehicles still stuck in the sand. The beach has become a slaughterhouse. The Marines fell in all directions. Shattered bodies were thrown into the air. Men screamed for help, not knowing where the shots were coming from. The black smoke mixed with the steam from the hot ground, making everything cloudy and suffocating. There was no shelter, there was no coverage. The volcanic sand did not allow for trenches. Bullets ricocheted off heads, blew out radios, pierced backpacks, and riddled bodies. Doctors ran from one side to the other, trying to stop bleeding with their hands, carrying the wounded on their backs, using their own bodies as human shields. Many did not return. Even so, the Marines did not retreat. Men like John Basilone, hero of Guadalcanal, were there. He was one of the first to step onto the sands of Iwo Jima, and also one of the first to die, struck by shrapnel after destroying an enemy position with his bare hands. It was the price of invasion. It was the beginning of horror. And as the ground shook and screams echoed in the chaos, American soldiers realized a terrible truth. They were not fighting men. Were fighting an entire island, and this island wanted to kill them. If you love real, raw, and intense war stories, subscribe and ring the bell. Beach at Iwo Jima had no ordinary sand. No, she was made of volcanic ash, thick, hot, stinking of sulfur, which sucked at the feet as if the island itself were trying to drag men to hell. Every step was a struggle, every meter a trap. The Marines stumbled forward, sinking up to their knees. Men screamed for help as they sank into hot holes, carrying 40-kilogram backpacks and rifles that now felt like anchors. And all this under a Japanese deluge of fire coming from all sides, from invisible positions, from tunnel mouths that opened and closed like the mouths of dragons. There was no coverage, nothing. The few craters that existed did not protect from anything. Every attempt to dig a trench in the soft sand resulted in the hole collapsing in on itself. It was not possible to escape, only advance or die. The tanks got stuck. Sherman armored cars could barely get off the beach, and when they did, they became easy targets for the Japanese anti-tank guns, which they appeared out of nowhere, shot, and then hid back in the caves. Many armored vehicles were destroyed before firing a single shot. Blood dripped onto the black sand. Mixed with dust, smoke, and sulfur, it created a viscous, red-hot slime where bodies fell, mixed together, and disappeared. It was impossible to collect all the wounded. Many died alone, trying to crawl, calling for their mother, for the doctor, for any name that would free them from death. The officers shouted orders that no one could hear. The noise of the Japanese machine guns was deafening. Zzz. Bullets cut through the air like sharp needles. Many fell before they could even raise their rifles. Others died with grenades still attached to their belts. And yet, the Marines advanced. crawling, creeping, pushing forward inch by inch like wounded animals trying to reach the top of a burning world. The black sand was the real enemy. It jammed boots, jammed weapons, swallowed men. It was hot as coal, hard as stone, treacherous as a snake. The Japanese, hidden, watched, and they shot. They always shot. By then, the Americans had already understood. Taking Iwo Jima would not be a matter of tactics, but of survival. There was no front line. The entire island was the front line. And the price, with each passing minute, was charged in blood, limbs, lives, and souls. Iwo Jima did not want to be conquered. She wanted to devour it. And there he was, Mount Suribachi, a sleeping giant in the southern corner of the island. A volcanic cone nearly 170 meters high, black, imposing, silent, but watching everything. From up there, the Japanese had a privileged view of the entire beach. It was as if the island itself had eyes, and they were focused on every American move. Every misstep, every man trying to hide, every tank was stuck in the mud. Nothing escaped Suribachi's vision. The hill was not just a natural elevation, it was a living fortress. Inside, Japanese engineers had dug labyrinths of tunnels, command rooms, armored bunkers and perfectly positioned machine gun nests. It was like facing a volcano that spewed bullets and death. Taking Suribachi was a matter of life and death. As long as that hill remained in enemy hands, any attempt to advance on the island would come under constant fire. The American commanders knew this, and so they gave the order. 8th Regiment of the 5th Marine Division was tasked with climbing hell. The advance was brutal. Every meter climbed was under machine gun fire. The Japanese were hiding in dark caves, armed to the teeth, determined to die fighting. It was close-quarters combat, hand-to-hand combat, knives, grenades, flamethrowers. Many American soldiers only knew that there was a Japanese man there when they felt the blade rip through their vest or a grenade explode inches away. For days, the Marines fought like ghosts amidst black rocks and thick smoke. The terrain was steep, treacherous, covered in blood and debris, and yet they did not retreat. With each tunnel conquered, each position destroyed, each enemy silenced, they climbed. One step at a time, one life at a time. And then, on the day February 23rd, 1945, 5 days after disembarkation, a small group of Marines reached the top. Up above, they planted a makeshift American flag. Small, quick, just to signal that the mountain was finally under control. The ships at sea honked. The soldiers below shouted with joy. But this scene was only the prelude. Later that same day, another group went up with a bigger flag, more visible, more symbolic. And it was there, in that moment frozen by the click of the camera, Joe Rosenthal, that the world would see one of the most iconic images of World War II, 6 soldiers raising the United States flag atop Iwo Jima, a scene of glory, of resistance, of unity, but also of sacrifice. Of the 6 men in that photo, 3 would die in the following days. Because despite the flag, despite the image, despite the emotion, the battle was far from over. Suribachi had fallen. Yes, but the heart of the island still pulsed with war. The tunnels were still crawling with enemies. The ground still shook with gunfire and explosions, and the blood still flowed. The mountain was conquered. But Iwo Jima still wanted more bodies, more blood, more pain. But even with the conquest of Mount Suribachi, the Americans soon realized that the worst was yet to come. Because the real enemy of Iwo Jima wasn't in the trenches. He lived underground. The battle now transformed into something completely different. It was no longer a battle of visible positions, as on the previous islands. Here, the war was against armed ghosts. American soldiers advanced across terrain they had already liberated minutes earlier, only to be attacked again from behind by enemies who seemed to reappear out of nowhere. And that's exactly what happened. Japanese engineering had created a colossal underground labyrinth. There were more than 20 kilometers of hand-dug tunnels connecting hundreds, of camouflaged fortifications, firing positions, bunkers, ammunition depots, command rooms, and even infirmaries, all buried beneath the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima, protected from any bomb. It was as if the entire island were a single, gigantic living fortress. And from inside this fortress, the Japanese attacked in silence. Machine guns appeared from camouflaged holes and then disappeared. Grenades were thrown through openings that looked like simple stones. Gunshots came from the walls, from the shadows, from the tunnels. The Americans responded with everything they had: grenades, flamethrowers, dynamite. It was a slow, violent, and absolutely inhuman fight. A game of cat and mouse, where the mouse knew every inch of the darkness. Often, Marines would clear a bunker, only to be surprised by a fresh wave of fire from another tunnel connected to that same position. It was like fighting inside a nightmare that recreated itself. Casualties mounted, morale fell, the heat was suffocating, the smell of death permeated everything. The tunnels were dark, stuffy, narrow, surrounded by traps. Grenades hung from wires. Japanese soldiers waited motionless in the shadows, bayonets poised to plunge into the first American who passed by. The only way to win was to kill everything inside, blow up entire tunnels, burn caves with flamethrowers, turn every Japanese shelter into a tomb of concrete and fire. But it didn't happen all at once. The island fought for every meter of ground, every hill, every rock, every hole was a new battlefield. And the Japanese, even though they died by the thousands, never backed down. On the contrary, they disappeared and came back. They always came back. Iwo Jima was no longer a mere island. It was now a cursed maze, where every step could be the last. And the Marines, exhausted, wounded, and maddened, began to understand that perhaps no one would leave there in one piece. As the tunnels continued to spit out death, the heart of the island awaited the Americans with sharp teeth. The advance toward the center of Iwo Jima became slower, dirtier, more painful. There was not only black rock and smoke here, there was total, savage, desperate resistance. The battlefields in the center of the island were like a board game from hell. Camouflaged pillboxes, machine gun nests disguised as rocks, mines buried with cruel precision. The soldiers never knew if their next step would take them to the ground or straight into an explosion. It was like crossing a land without rules, where everything around you could kill you. With each hill conquered, another one appeared behind it, even more fortified. With each position taken, grenades rained down from the flanks. With each group that advanced, new crossfire emerged from places where supposedly there was no one else. Japanese engineers had built veritable underground fortresses there, concrete blocks with walls over 2 meters thick, resistant even to direct fire from tanks. To destroy them, the Americans needed to get up close and personal and pay the price in blood. It was in this part of the island that the flamethrowers became the most feared and most used weapon. Entire teams of soldiers equipped with fuel tanks on their backs and steel hoses climbed hills and approached the bunkers. And then liquid hell was unleashed. Flames of over 900 degrees Celsius invaded the tunnels, spread through the galleries and burned everything: men, ammunition, oxygen. It was brutal. It was inhumane, but it was the only way. Even so, the Japanese continued to fight until their last breath. There was no surrender. There was no retreat. They would rather bury themselves alive in the tunnels than be captured. Or worse, they waited in silence, lying among the bodies of their dead comrades, to throw one last grenade, pull the trigger one last time. And there were the Marines, covered in soot, covered in blood and sand, their eyes dry with horror. They advanced, but there was no glory there. Each night fewer men returned. Each morning the same names stopped being called on the list. The center of the island looked like a rift in time, a prison of smoke and death, where the rules of war disappeared and all that remained was the instinct for survival. Just one more meter, said the commanders, but that subway cost dozens of lives, and yet they continued, because stopping meant dying, and retreat. It was unthinkable. As the sun disappeared behind the island's black horizon, there was no relief, there was no silence, there was no rest, there was no peace. What was coming was true terror. The nights on Iwo Jima were vivid. It was when the Japanese, hidden in the bowels of the earth, woke up like nocturnal predators. They emerged from holes, craters, hidden tunnels, and attacked with an ancient fury. Silent charges, bayonet slashes, point-blank shots, hand grenades thrown in the dark. The exhausted Marines could barely sleep for more than 20 minutes. Every noise was suspicious. Every shadow was an enemy. Many preferred not to sleep. They sat, leaning on their rifles, waiting, knowing that at any second they could die. The ambushes came like deadly whispers. Small groups of Japanese crawled for hours in total darkness, covered in volcanic dust, until they reached the American positions. And then they attacked, without shouting, without hesitation. Deathmatch, hand-to-hand combat, knife against knife, finger against trigger. It was chaos. It was the nighttime hell of Iwo Jima. Many Marines died in their sleep. Others woke up covered in blood, not their own, but that of the enemy, dead inches away. It was a constant waking nightmare. Sometimes the Japanese pretended to be dead during the day, covered their faces with dark dust, lay down among the corpses, and waited for night to fall. Then they would rise up and kill. Suicide attacks were also frequent. Japanese soldiers strapped explosives to their bodies and ran at American tanks or groups of soldiers, screaming, exploding, killing. The Americans tried everything: reflectors, traps, perimeters with hanging cans, improvised sensors, but it was useless. Darkness was the enemy's greatest ally. Every night was a lottery of death, and yet the men held on because there was no choice. There, on the cursed island, sleep was a luxury, and live until dawn, it was a victory. The final line, the last Japanese strongholds. The date was March 16th, 1945, after nearly a month of non-stop carnage. The American Marines had finally pushed the Japanese defenders to the southern tip of Iwo Jima, but those who hoped the end was near did not know the true nature of the hell that awaited them. What lay ahead was not simply the end of the battle. It was the climax of a symphony of death that would transform men into ghosts and soldiers into demons. The final redoubt, more than fortresses, an underground world. The final Japanese positions were not mere bunkers or trenches. They were underground, cities built with the precision of engineers and the desperation of doomed men. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, architect of this final stand, had transformed the south of the island into a labyrinth of death that stretched for miles beneath the volcanic surface. These final fortifications were feats of military engineering that defied all conventional warfare. Main tunnels over 3 meters high snaked for hundreds of meters, connecting command chambers, ammunition depots, makeshift hospitals, and dormitories carved into the volcanic rock. Some complexes had up to 20 different entrances, each disguised among the island's jagged rocks, making it impossible to fully map the system. The Japanese had learned from every bombing raid and airstrike of the previous months. The tunnel walls were reinforced with steel beams salvaged from sunken ships, and the ceilings were covered with layers of concrete, earth, and volcanic rock that could withstand even the 16-inch shells of American warships. Ingenious ventilation systems allowed hundreds of men to breathe in the depths, while water reservoirs carved into the rock ensured supplies, even under total siege. Kuribayashi, the ghost who ruled the dead. General Kuribayashi, in those final days, had become more than just a military commander. He was a dark legend that haunted both his own men and his enemies. Wounded by shrapnel from previous battles, his uniform torn and stained with dried blood, he moved through the tunnels like a specter of war. His eyes, once bright with the confidence of a brilliant strategist, now reflected only the iron determination of a man who had accepted his death. but not his defeat. Kuribayashi knew, with the cruel clarity of military mathematics, that victory was impossible. The numbers didn't lie. Of his original 22,000 men, perhaps 1,500 remained fit for combat. Ammunition was scarce. Food had become a distant memory. Drinking water was rationed by the drop of a hat. Medicine had run out weeks ago, and the wounded moaned in the dark corners of the tunnels, some delirious with fever, others simply awaiting death. But the general had made a promise to the emperor, a promise that transcended military logic and entered the realm of the sacred. Every American who died on Iwo Jima would be an offering to the spirit of Japan. Every day the resistance continued would be another day for the homeland to prepare for the inevitable invasion. And if he must die, and he knew he must, then he would die taking as many of his enemies with him as possible. His final orders to his subordinates were simple and terrifying. Do not die needlessly. Die killing. Every bullet must find American flesh. Every shell must explode among them. Every inch of land must be watered with enemy blood before it is conquered. War beyond war, when technology meets barbarism. In the final tunnels of Iwo Jima, World War II regressed to something primitive and visceral. All modern technology, Sherman tanks, heavy artillery, air support, was rendered useless in the narrow galleries where men faced each other just meters apart. It was World War I trench warfare mixed with medieval hand-to-hand combat, where the difference between life and death was measured in reflexes, brute strength, and sheer will to survive. The Marines, veterans of Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Tarawa, men who had seen the worst war had to offer, found themselves in a kind of combat no training could prepare them for. In the dark, tunnels where flashlights cast dancing shadows and every echo could mean death, they fought not just Japanese soldiers, but their own most primal fears. Underground combat required a different kind of courage. Above ground, a man could see the enemy, assess the situation, and make tactical decisions. In the tunnels, every turn was Russian roulette. Each chamber might contain a Japanese soldier waiting with a bayonet, a grenade with the pin already pulled, or simply the silent emptiness that precedes a deadly ambush. The Japanese, for their part, had adapted to this environment like nocturnal predators. They knew every stone, every curve, every echo of its labyrinths. They moved in absolute silence, communicating through signals they had developed during weeks of living underground. Some had lost so much weight they resembled walking skeletons, but their eyes shone with a fanatical intensity that chilled the Marines' blood. The final strongholds, architecture of death each. Underground complex was unique in its configuration, but they all shared a common characteristic. They were designed to kill as many invaders as possible before being destroyed. The most impressive of these strongholds was known to the Marines as the amphitheater complex, a system of expanded and fortified natural caverns that stretched for over 400 meters on multiple levels. This complex had 16 known entrances, each defended by carefully camouflaged machine gun positions. The main entrances were protected by welded steel doors, with small openings that allowed defenders to fire while remaining completely protected. Other entrances were disguised as natural crevices in the rock, impossible to detect until machine gun fire emerged from the shadows. The interior of the complex was a military engineering nightmare. Main corridors branched off into dozens of secondary tunnels, creating a three-dimensional maze that was easy to get lost in and impossible to fully map. Command chambers were connected by improvised communication systems, military telephone wires intertwined with cables salvaged from destroyed equipment. The Japanese had booby-trapped every meter of these tunnels. Captured American landmines were repositioned at strategic points. Grenades were tied to nearly invisible wires, ready to explode if anyone tripped. False walls hid soldiers with bayonets, waiting for the perfect moment to attack. Some tunnels were deliberately collapsed, creating bottlenecks where invaders would be forced to crowd together, making them easy targets. But perhaps most sinister were the death chambers, small compartments where Japanese soldiers hid with grenades, waiting for groups of Marines to pass by. When the moment arrived, they would pull the pins and blow themselves up along with their enemies, transforming themselves into human bombs in a final act of sacrifice. Fire and dynamite, the deadly dance of destruction. American tactics for dealing with these underground fortresses evolved into a brutal combination of fire and explosives that would become known as fire, then dynamite, a phrase that summed up the only effective way to clear the Japanese tunnels. The process began with the flamethrowers. These soldiers, carrying fuel tanks that made them prime targets, approached the tunnel entrances with a courage bordering on madness. The flamethrowers' gelatinous fuel didn't just burn, it stuck to everything, creating infernos that could last for several minutes. When directed into a tunnel, the fire consumed all available oxygen, suffocating the defenders or forcing them to emerge and be slaughtered. But the fire was only the first step. Even after the flames were extinguished, the tunnels remained dangerous. Wounded but still alive, Japanese soldiers could be waiting in the depths. Charred bodies could hide grenades with pins pulled, and there was always the possibility of secondary tunnels that the fire hadn't reached. That's when the demolition experts came in, men carrying charges of TNT and dynamite like others carried rifles. They descended into the still smoldering tunnels, breathing toxic air and walking on still glowing ash, to place explosives at strategic points. The goal was not only to kill the survivors, but to completely collapse the tunnel system, ensuring it could never be used again. This combination of fire and explosives created scenes that seemed to have come straight from hell itself. When the charges detonated, columns of fire and black smoke emerged from multiple openings simultaneously, as if the earth itself was spewing the flames of the underworld. The sound of the explosions echoed through the remaining tunnels, creating a subterranean roar that could be felt through the soles of the Marines' boots. On the surface, diabolical traps, the ingenuity of desperation. The Japanese, facing extinction, had developed traps that demonstrated a sinister creativity born of absolute desperation. Each device was designed not just to kill, but to terrorize, to make the Marines' every step fearful. The simplest booby traps were also the most effective. Captured American grenades were tied to nearly invisible wire, stretched ankle-high in dark corridors. A Marine tripping over the wire would pull the grenade's pin, which exploded seconds later, maiming not only the victim, but any nearby comrades. More elaborate were the improvised pressure mines. Grenades were placed under the bodies of dead soldiers, both Japanese and American, so that any attempt to move the body would result in an explosion. Some bodies were even rigged with multiple grenades, ensuring the explosion would be devastating. The false walls represented perhaps the height of Japanese deadly ingenuity. Sections of tunnels that appeared to end in dead ends actually hid Japanese soldiers in secret compartments. When American patrols approached to investigate, the soldiers would emerge from behind, attacking with bayonets or knives in hand-to-hand combat, where the American technological advantage completely disappeared. Some tunnels contained makeshift gas chambers, where the Japanese had installed containers of chemicals that, when broken by grenades, created toxic clouds. While not lethal like the war gases of World War I, they were strong enough to cause temporary blindness and respiratory problems, leaving the Marines vulnerable to subsequent attacks. Perhaps the most disturbing were the psychological traps. Wounded Japanese soldiers were left in visible positions, groaning in pain, seemingly helpless. When Marines approached to help or capture the wounded man, grenades hidden under the body exploded, killing both the victim and the rescuers. This tactic forced the Americans to adopt the brutal policy of not approaching any fallen Japanese until they were confirmed dead. The human cost. When every meter cost lives, progress through the last Japanese strongholds couldn't be measured in kilometers or even hundreds of meters. It was measured in lives, American lives paid for every meter of tunnel conquered, every chamber cleared, every position destroyed. American casualties during this final phase of the battle were proportionally the highest of the entire Pacific campaign. Entire platoons of Marines entered tunnel complexes in the morning, and only handfuls of survivors emerged by nightfall. Companies that had begun the battle with 200 men now fought with 30 or 40 men, commanded by sergeants because all the officers had been killed or wounded. The injuries sustained in underground combat were particularly horrific. Flamethrower burns covered entire bodies. Shrapnel from grenades in confined spaces caused multiple wounds that were often fatal. Bayonet wounds, rare in other phases of the war, became common in the tunnels where men fought just inches apart. But perhaps worse than the physical injuries were the psychological toll. Veteran Marines, men who had faced banzai charges and artillery bombardments without flinching, began to develop what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The constant combat in confined spaces, the tension of never knowing when a booby trap would explode, the horror of finding comrades maimed by booby traps, all of this took a mental toll that many would never fully recover. Some Marines developed a pathological aversion to confined spaces that would last the rest of their lives. Others suffered recurring nightmares about endless tunnels filled with invisible enemies. And some simply stopped functioning as soldiers, sitting in dark corners of the tunnels, staring blankly into space, their minds having retreated to places where the war could not reach them. The agony of the defenders. When humanity meets its limits. On the Japanese side, the situation had transcended any conventional definition of human suffering. The soldiers defending these last positions were no longer men in the traditional sense. They were ghosts of flesh and blood, kept alive only by willpower and the fanaticism that had been hammered into their souls since childhood. Hunger had become a constant companion. Rations had run out weeks ago, and the soldiers survived on roots dug from the volcanic earth, dirty water collected from rain puddles, and occasionally meat from rats that infested the tunnels. Some had resorted to cannibalism, feeding on the bodies of dead comrades, a practice that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the war, but was now accepted as a necessity for survival. The thirst was even worse than the hunger. Drinking water had become more precious than ammunition. Soldiers drank their own urine. They licked condensation from the tunnel walls. Some went so far as to drink contaminated water from puddles where decomposing bodies had been left, preferring to risk disease rather than die of dehydration. Medical conditions were apocalyptic. Wounds quickly became infected in the damp, filthy environment of the tunnels. Without medication, soldiers died from injuries that would have been easily treatable under normal conditions. Dysentery was rampant, leaving men so weak they could barely hold their weapons. Some soldiers had developed eye infections that left them partially or completely blind, but they continued to fight, guided by comrades or simply firing in the direction of American sounds. Perhaps most disturbing was the mental state of the defenders. Many had developed a form of war-induced psychosis, where reality and hallucinations blurred. Soldiers spoke to comrades who had been dead for weeks. Others believed they were fighting in completely different battles, in places that existed only in their fragmented minds. Some had regressed to an almost animalistic state, attacking anything that moved, including their own comrades. Human bombs, desperation's last resort. When ammunition, food, and hope ran out, the Japanese turned to the most terrifying weapon of all, their own bodies. The practice of strapping explosives to one's body and transforming oneself into a human bomb was not new in the Pacific War, but on Iwo Jima, it reached unprecedented levels of frequency and desperation. Japanese soldiers, some so weak from hunger they could barely walk, strapped grenades, dynamite or any available explosives to their chests and launched themselves at American positions. Some wore belts made of strapped grenades, creating explosions that could kill or injure dozens of Marines. Others carried backpacks filled with explosives, transforming themselves into walking bombs that could destroy entire bunkers. Most disturbingly, many of these suicide attacks were carried out by soldiers who were clearly injured or ill. Men with arms or legs amputated by shrapnel dragged themselves toward American lines, carrying explosives. Blinded soldiers were guided by comrades to positions where they could blow themselves up among groups of Marines. Some were so weak that they collapsed before reaching their targets, exploding alone in empty craters. These suicide attacks created a constant climate of paranoia among the Marines. Any movement in the shadows could be an approaching Japanese soldier with explosives. Apparently dead bodies could be feigning suicide, waiting for the right moment to detonate hidden grenades. The line between the living and the dead, between enemies and corpses, had become dangerously blurred. Improvised weapons. When metal runs out, fury remains. With ammunition nearly exhausted, Japanese soldiers resorted to weapons straight out of medieval nightmares. Rusty bayonets, some so corroded they could barely cut, were sharpened on volcanic rock into jagged but deadly blades. Scraps of metal from destroyed equipment were fashioned into makeshift knives, with handles made from torn uniform cloth. Some soldiers fashioned primitive spears by tying knives or sharp pieces of metal to wooden handles or metal pipes. These weapons, though rudimentary, were effective in close combat in the narrow tunnels, where rifles and machine guns were difficult to maneuver. Sharp volcanic rocks became deadly projectiles. Japanese soldiers threw them with lethal precision, aiming for the eyes and faces of Marines. Some rocks were heated in a fire before being thrown, causing burns in addition to impact injuries. Perhaps the most primitive and terrifying were the bare-handed attacks. Japanese soldiers, completely unarmed, would rush at Marines, intending to strangle them or claw out their eyes. These attacks, though rarely successful, created a profound psychological terror, the image of men so desperate they were willing to fight to the death with only their bare hands. Phantom Command, Kuribayashi, in the last days. By the final days of the resistance, General Kuribayashi had become a near mythical figure, both to his own men and to the Americans trying to capture him. Wounded multiple times, his uniform in tatters and his body marked by battle scars, he continued to command his remaining men with a determination that defied all military logic. Kuribayashi had established his final command post in one of the deepest chambers of the underground complex, a location the Marines were never able to pinpoint. From there, he issued orders through a makeshift communication system that included human messengers, coded light signals, and even drums made from metal helmets. His final orders were simple but brutal. Each soldier was to kill at least 10 Americans before dying. There would be no surrender. There would be no retreat. Every position would be defended to the last man, and when there were no more men left, the positions would be destroyed to deny the enemy any benefit. The general had become an obsession for American commanders. Capturing or killing Kuribayashi had become an almost personal goal, not only for military reasons, but because his continued resistance had become a symbol of Japanese resolve that needed to be broken. But Kuribayashi remained elusive, moving through the tunnels like a ghost, always one step ahead of the Marines hunting him. Some American soldiers began to doubt his continued existence, speculating that perhaps he was merely a myth created to maintain Japanese morale. Others believed he had become something more than human, a supernatural force fueling Japanese resistance. The silence that was not peace. When finally only hundreds of Japanese defenders remained, then dozens, and finally silence descended on the tunnels of Iwo Jima, the Marines discovered that peace was a cruel illusion. Silence didn't mean victory, it only meant that the most visible phase of the battle was over. In the now cleaned tunnels, charred and mutilated bodies created a scene that haunted even the most seasoned veterans. Blood-stained walls told stories of desperate fighting. Destroyed equipment and improvised weapons strewn across the floor testified to the defenders' fanatical determination. But even in the silence, danger remained. Isolated Japanese soldiers still hid in undiscovered tunnels, occasionally emerging for suicide attacks on unsuspecting American patrols. Unexploded booby traps lay in wait for unwary victims, and there was always the possibility that more tunnels would be discovered, revealing new pockets of resistance. The silence also carried the weight of the dead. Thousands of bodies, both American and Japanese, lay in the tunnels. And on the island's surface, the smell of death had become so pervasive that Marines wore makeshift masks to breathe. Flies swarmed in black clouds, and the constant sound of their buzzing had become the soundtrack of victory. For the surviving sailors, the silence was almost worse than the fighting. For weeks, they had lived in a state of constant alert, where every sound could mean danger. Now, in the eerie stillness that followed the battle, many found they could not relax. Their bodies and minds had adapted to war so much that peace seemed unnatural, almost threatening. The legacy of the last strongholds. The last Japanese strongholds of Iwo Jima left a legacy that transcended the battle itself. They demonstrated the depths of human resolve when faced with total extinction. They showed that even the most advanced military technology could be neutralized by ingenuity born of desperation. For the Americans, these final strongholds served as a grim warning of what awaited them if they attempted to invade mainland Japan. If Japanese soldiers fought with such ferocity on a volcanic island with no real strategic value, what would they do defending their homeland, their temples, their families? For the Japanese, the last strongholds became a symbol of resistance that would echo through the decades. The determination of Kuribayashi and his men, their refusal to accept defeat, even in the face of impossible odds, created a narrative of tragic heroism that would influence post-war Japanese culture. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was the transformation of the combatants themselves. The Marines who survived the final tunnels of Iwo Jima were never the same. They had looked into the eyes of total war, had seen the depths of humankind's capacity to inflict and endure suffering. Some carried these memories like invisible scars for the rest of their lives. Others found in them a source of strength that would sustain them through any future adversity. The last Japanese strongholds on Iwo Jima weren't just the end of a battle. They were the end of an era of innocence about the nature of modern warfare. They showed that when civilization is stripped of its superficial layers, what remains is the fundamental human capacity to fight, suffer, and die for what one believes in. And in the silence that finally descended upon those blood-stained tunnels, a terrible truth echoed. That peace, when it finally arrives, is often more fragile and precious than those who never lost it can imagine. The silence was not the end of the story. It was merely a pause before humanity discovered new ways to test the limits of its own resilience and cruelty. The final line had been crossed, but the price paid for that crossing would echo through generations, reminding everyone that some victories cost so much that they transform both victors and vanquished into something different from what they were before. On Iwo Jima, deep within those last strongholds, war had revealed both. The worst and the best of human nature, leaving scars that would never fully heal. Kuribayashi's final attack, the last suicide rush. It was dawn. A heavy silence hung over the southern tip of Iwo Jima. The Americans believed that finally, after more than a month of massacre, the battle was coming to an end. Many Marines were already letting down their guard. Some slept in makeshift shelters. Others spoke in whispers, their eyes lost, exhausted, drained, destroyed inside. But Kuribayashi was still, alive, and with him a last plan. His ultimate act of defiance, a final attack, not to win, but to die fighting. On the night of March 25, 1945, around 5 a.m., nearly 300 Japanese soldiers, hungry, wounded, bloodshot-eyed, and armed with what they still had, emerged from the caves in a surprise attack on the American 5th Engineer Corps, stationed near Praia Verde. It was like an infernal apparition. Screams rent the air, grenades exploded amid the tents, knives glinted in the gloom. It was no ordinary military attack. It was a suicidal, desperate, apocalyptic attack. The Japanese advanced, screaming, exploding, cutting, burning, a storm of death. Some threw themselves onto tanks rigged with explosives. Others entered the tents, killing everything they saw. American soldiers were beheaded in their sleep. Others died trying to protect their comrades. Chaos took over the camp. Explosions shook the earth. Black smoke covered the field. Screams, gunshots, flames, blood. The Americans resisted with everything they had. Point-blank shootings, hand-to-hand combat, and bayonet attacks. Even cooks and nurses took up rifles and joined the fight. It was hours of horror. When the sun finally rose in the grey sky, the ground was covered in bodies. The attack had been contained, but the cost was high. More than 100 Americans dead and more than 260 injured. And almost all of the Japanese attackers lay dead. Kuribayashi was never found. It is assumed that died fighting with his men as he had promised. That attack was the last gasp of Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima, a last breath of hatred, honor and sacrifice in a place where life no longer had value, only the duty to fight to the end. Flags in the wind, the icon of Mount Suribachi. In the middle of the hell of Iwo Jima, a symbol was born. Something that would span generations, that would become an eternal image of World War II, the raising of the American flag atop Mount Suribachi. It was February 23rd, 1945. The battle was still far from over, but after days of brutal fighting, troops of the 5th Marine Division managed to reach the top of that dormant volcano, heart of the island, and one of the most strategic points of the battle. Taking Suribachi was a desperate struggle. Meter by meter, tunnel by tunnel, the Japanese fought ferociously to the last man. But finally, the Marines managed to subdue him. And then, at 10:20 in the morning, a flag was raised. Small, makeshift, torn, but enough to dye the entire beach. Below erupted in screams of euphoria. Soldiers applauded, cried, raised their helmets, but that wasn't the image that would go down in history. Later that day, a second flag, larger, more visible, was raised in the same place. And it was at this moment that photographer Joe Rosenthal pressed the camera button. The image captured 6 Marines raising the American flag together in a collective, symbolic, almost sacred effort. It was more than a gesture of victory. The representation of all the struggle, sacrifice and hope of the United States in that brutal war. That photo went around the world. It was on the cover of newspapers, magazines, books. It became a statue. It inspired recruitment posters, and it was immortalized in the collective memory. But there is one important detail. When that picture was taken, Iwo Jima was still far from being conquered. Most of the Marines that appear in the image would be killed days later, i.e., that flag did not mark the end of the war. It marked the price of victory, the price of each meter, human and logistical cost of the battle. Every yard gained on Iwo Jima was paid for with blood, flesh, and bones. There's no exaggeration in this statement. The island's black soil was literally soaked in pain, sacrifice, and death. In just 36 days of combat, the United States lost about 7,000 men. More than 20,000 were injured. And the Japanese, well, of the 21,000 soldiers who defended Iwo Jima, less than 300 survived. It was the only battle in the Pacific in which the Americans lost more soldiers than the Japanese. Yes, the Japanese fought to their last breath, but the cost was brutal for both sides. The Marines advanced centimeters per day, crawling through smoking craters, among shrapnel, corpses, howls, and the unbearable smell of burning flesh. The volcanic sand sucked into the boots and exposed the soldiers to enemy fire, without any cover. Bullets came from all sides, from bunkers, holes, tunnels, and even from the backs of mountains. Nothing was safe, no step was certain. The field doctors, known as corpsmen, became silent heroes. They dragged mutilated bodies under heavy fire. They administered morphine with trembling hands. Many died trying to save their companions. The flamethrowers, one of the most feared weapons, were priority targets for the Japanese. They carried tanks on their backs, and when hit, they exploded into balls of human fire. The fences were stuck. We stuck to our arms. He was punishing at headquarters, and still they pressed on, because there was no choice, because to retreat was to die. In command, the generals knew the price, but they also knew that without Iwo Jima, the final attack on mainland Japan would be much bloodier. Every drop of blood spilled, there would supposedly be the price to pay to avoid even more deaths later. But how do you measure this? How do you justify the horror? How do you tell families? For many who returned, Iwo Jima never ended. The island remained etched in memories, in nightmares, in the eyes that saw hell and survived. March 26, 1945, marked the end of the Battle of Iwo Jima. But there was no celebration, only a deathly silence that hung over an island transformed into a cemetery. The ground, once volcanic sand, was now a field of craters, debris, and mutilated bodies. The last Japanese were eliminated in desperate struggles in the tunnels, like ghosts who refused to die. Victory was won inch by inch with flamethrowers, grenades, and blood. When the Marines finally emerged from the fighting, they walked like zombies, staring into space. They had won, but at the cost of thousands of lives. The occupation began immediately. Iwo Jima was transformed into an air base, crucial for landing damaged B-29 bombers. Thousands of airmen were saved thanks to that conquered rock, but the price paid would never be forgotten. The famous image of the 6 Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi became a national icon, even though 3 of them died shortly thereafter. For the survivors, that photo didn't tell the real story, only the trauma and hell they experienced there could. Many returned silent, forever scarred. Despite the pain, Iwo Jima had a real strategic impact. It helped shorten the war and saved lives, but no military advantage can justify the void left in families. Today, Iwo Jima, or Ioto, is a silent memorial. No civilians live there. Only Japanese soldiers stand watch over the black rock where so many fell. Iwo Jima was more than a battle. It was the limit of human endurance and the depths of suffering, a cruel reminder that every victory in war comes at a price, and it is always paid in blood.